Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, and thank you. Thank you to the Foundation for inviting me to this dialogue with Professor Milanovic. I'm a very proud fellow of the Foundation, and I love being on this side. I'm going to switch to English now for my conversation with the professor. And if there are questions in Spanish, that's perfect, but I'm switching to English now.
Talk about this fantastic book that you've written. I recommend it to everyone. I would like to open with, you mentioned this, how this rebalancing with the rise of China and India of the global income distribution, how people in the lower part of the income distribution in European countries, advanced countries, now are lower in the income distribution. But I did have this question that you already mentioned, like, how does this Italian working class person realize that they are lower? Because, and I want to just make the point before letting you answer, you are making these calculations in purchasing power parity, so adjusting for prices, but this Chinese person who is in the median is still has less dollars to buy in the international market than the European. So obviously it's affecting our lives, but how do people realize this? Is it that they are out of job? Is it that they cannot buy certain things?
You know, I think actually, I don't know, it's like everybody's guess, but I think that the ranking does matter at some point, and you don't realize it because we don't think in those terms. We don't even think exactly about our exact ranking nationally. Many people don't. But that message, that information gets conveyed to you through inability, as I was saying before, to access, to buy some services or some goods. And let me indirectly answer. I had a discussion several years ago with Paul Collier, who wrote the book, The Future of Capitalism. It's very critical of the most recent trends in the rich countries. And then he talks about the time when he was young, and he says how great it was that any Englishman would just go stride around the world, and they would all look up to that Englishman, and he would feel really very powerful and very rich and so on. And I said, Paul, but this is a very good idea, but it was not so great for these guys who actually looked at you. These Englishmen knew that he was rich. And actually, you just need to read English literature on colonialism to figure out that they all knew that they are rich. So that message does come transmitted to you. And I think it does transmitted it even in Spain. But obviously, like countries such as Spain, like Italy, which are very attractive for foreigners, for tourists, come. And of course, for example, I've talked about that in Barcelona, increase in the price of the apartments. Part of that is Airbnb, which is foreigners who come there, others foreigners who buy apartments, many European, but there are others also, Chinese, Russians, Indians, and so forth. So I think that message would eventually transpire. But I don't explain, just if I can just say that, I don't explain the present political turbulence only by the reshuffling. I explain it by a reshuffling combined with the realization that the top of your national income distribution has grown faster than you, and their position has not changed. And indeed, when you look at the very top of the global income distribution, the importance of Western countries, and the US in particular, US is 40% of the global top 5. So that has not changed. Now, it could change, but it has not changed so far.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about these economic forces that lead to political responses. So in the last 10 years, we've seen the world change in the US, in UK, everywhere. A lot of these parties that defend nationalism and protection from abroad, both in trade and in immigration, have been successful. And it's always puzzled me that in the 1990s, the parties that were defending, or the side of the spectrum that was defending closing borders, etc., was the left, not the right. And instead, it's been the right-wing parties that have been more successful at defending this platform. Right now, we have, on the left, we have Piketty, Zuckman proposing that what we have to do is just tax wealth, which is these people at the top that you have been defining. Do you think that's a strategy that is going to be successful within this new world order of national market liberalism, or do you think there's more fundamental forces and just trying to tax this wealth is not a political platform that people are going to vote for?
Let me just first very briefly try to, because I have not done it, and it's an important term. Actually, as my wife said, actually it sounds better in Spanish than in English. National market liberalism. neoliberalism, liberalism de mercato nacional. And actually, the term of national liberalism was used by Polanyi. The idea is the following, that liberalism in the most general terms defined has two components. There is the domestic and there is international. Domestic is well known, we all know it. It is free market, deregulation, labor flexibility, put whatever, we know that. Free pricing, and so on. International is floating of free exchange rate, low tariffs, movement of capital, all this. So what I think is actually happening, and not only because of Trump, there are other examples of that. Well, the international part is now returning to neo-mercantilism or mercantilistic policies. Mm-hmm. And I think so you can forget about the international part because the use of economic coercion, and speaking of that in Madrid after yesterday's events, is kind of obvious. But it's obvious even today. Actually, economic coercion is part of the normal toolkit that practically all countries are now using. So that part is gone. And actually where it remains is at the national level and at the market, because I think there policies would actually deepen neoliberalism and there will be retraction in social spheres. I meant in the US in particular, all this stuff about, with the equal opportunity, with affirmative action, all that social part of liberalism would be also kind of left aside. So that was the origin of the title. Now, how about the parties? I have to say, I'm in favor of the Zuckman tax and all that, but I'm very skeptical about the ability of social democratic parties to come back. And I'm skeptical because I think the underlying conditions have changed in many respects that many of you know much better than I, and I just do not see them. I do not see that they have a plan, a platform that is sufficiently attractive. And I think that they, of course, then move towards what used to be the right-wing platform, which was, for example, anti-immigration, which I understand that, for example, Nordic parties, socialist parties, are totally anti-immigration. And if you think, actually, if there is a plank of socialism that was very clear, it was cosmopolitan part. So they decided to, let's get rid of that part and we'll keep it, and without being pejorative, but that's actually, to some extent, national socialism.
Yeah. So in this national market liberalism that you define that is taking shape, you have a mix of tariffs, so protection against competition from abroad. You have restricted immigration, but this is being applied by societies that are aging, where productivity growth is falling. We are in a weak fiscal position. So is this sustainable? Like it might deal with this inequality, at least in the short term, but is it sustainable in the long term to apply this policy mix?
It's very difficult for me to say because, first of all, I need macroeconomists there, and you actually. And I need, obviously, one would need to make projections, and we know that the fiscal part, what I've actually read, I've never done that myself, but I read actually the fiscal part becomes at some point very difficult to sustain because of the relatively high level of pensions, or even if it's not direct pensions, it is actually through the investment in pension funds, and then, of course, extended life expectancy of people, and the fact that people might spend actually a larger part, maybe 30, 40 years, actually basically receiving the pension from the work that was maybe 30 years long. So, I don't know if it is sustainable. I do think that, how should I say, that the forces of change, both in economic terms, which I've just described, and demographically because of Africa, I think both of these forces work against Europe, actually. There was a change in the relative positions, we have seen that, and demographically, Europe is becoming, of course, smaller than it was like 100 years ago. So.
Definitely, and that is true. And I also wanted to ask you, you don't talk in the book much about Europe, so it's not a very present, you talk a lot about China, the US. I was trying to think about the role of Europe in all these changes. So, of course, the US is no longer a reliable ally politically or economically. It's not treating Europe as an ally. And some governments have started slowly trying to approach China and try to develop some better relationship with China, although we already have some relationship. But we do have like large trade deficits with China because they have lower labor costs still. Is that a reasonable approach? Where should Europe fall in this geoeconomic game, given that you're losing your main ally and the alternative is not that appealing?
Well, it is, it's impossible. I don't know. It's really a difficult question. I'm at a loss. I don't want now to criticize the European Union, but I'm at a loss to understand the logic of the European Union. And if you look at just purely from the outside, for starting with Europe and Russia, they are absolutely complementary. So the war has led Europe to willingly cut all the links. And that is economically not good. But Europe never believed that the US would somehow turn against Europe. Or not turn, but at least would not be as accommodating as it was. Then it finds the US not being accommodating as it was. But now supports the war in the Middle East, which is also economically against the European interest. And then, of course, the only normal actor in this world remains China, so obviously then you have to go, as I would call it, pilgrimage to China, because they did go one after another to the pilgrimage. So I do think that the pilgrimage is a good idea, but the pilgrimage is a result, I think, of, in my opinion, really policies that are difficult to understand from a rational perspective. But it could be that there are other objectives that people pursue.
So let's go back to the protagonist of the book, which is really China and its rise. So we've already described the impact of the growth that China has sustained for 40 years now. That growth has been slowing, and there's a number of reasons why it's been slowing. So it used to be 10% per year, and that compounds very quickly. Now they are at 5%. And in the parts of the book where you are courageous enough to predict or extrapolate what's going to happen in the next few years, you think that the central scenario might be that they keep growing at 5%, and they keep growing more than the US and Europe, so the gap keeps closing. So I see, let me tell you how I see it, and you tell me how. Yeah. I see some positive signs for being positive about China. In some fields, they caught up very quickly because they were very far from the technological frontier, but now they are at the frontier or pushing the frontier in electric vehicles, batteries, solar energy, etc. In universities, recently some rankings came out, and Chinese universities are really populating the top 10 and the top 100 in competition with the US. There's now no country that can compete in terms of the quality of the universities with China, and actually Chinese students are stopping. They used to come to European and US universities. They don't come anymore, and that's creating a crisis in that sector. But they also have things against them. So now they are at the frontier, so they are going to advance more slowly, and they also have the demographic problem that we all have. Their population is already shrinking. And I don't know if China in the future, in this national market liberalism, is going to accept immigration to the extent that we have done it or the US has done it to have a population growth. So I'm not sure we can definitely be optimistic about Chinese growth. What are your thoughts on
No,
this?
I totally agree with all that you said, actually. My idea simply my sort of basic assumption was that China would grow at 2% or even 3% faster than the US. And when you do that calculation, you find, and you ask the following question. This is, I think, an interesting question. You cannot ask a question when China's GDP per capita will catch the US, because it really would be quite far. The gap is still very large. And moreover, when it happens, and if it happens, China will be so much more powerful than the United States simply because it has so many more people. But then you can ask a question, when would China have equal number of rich people, and you define some level, I define it as the US median income. When China, currently there are about 150 million Americans who are above the median by definition. When would China have 150 million people who are above that median? Currently it has 40 million. And then essentially you find that China needs one generation, 20 years, if it grows 3% higher. If it goes 2% higher, it becomes almost 2 generations. So it becomes like almost 40 years in order to catch up the United States. So that was my sort of a basic scenario, very simplistic but basic scenario. But it could be that actually if that gap becomes 1%, then of course I don't know what are the numbers, but as you know, they are actually they are exponential. So basically it could be like 4 generations. And it's possible. However, really, China is still a relatively poor country. So while some sectors are, as you said, at the frontier, and presumably they cannot grow more than 1% and 2%, although that is also debatable with artificial intelligence. Maybe artificial intelligence would give another push to the frontier. But if there are other sectors in China, and I think rural China is relatively poor, where actually that constraint does not hold. So basically, I would say that I am still quite optimistic on China, but I don't think that China would go to, as you said, actually, to the rates of 8% again. So I think it is, at least for a while, I don't see it. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. So you say something in the book that I found quite interesting, which is some people in the 2000s, 2010s had this hope, and they were theorizing that, most countries, when they develop, they become liberal democracies. So when China gets to a certain level of development, it will become a liberal democracy. You think this is a very naive view, and this is not going to happen, and whatever, or very unlikely to happen. Whatever happens in China, they might have internal struggle and changes in regime, but this won't necessarily become a democracy, and definitely China will not integrate in a US-led world.
Yeah.
So you think that at best we'll have a new bipolar world where we have the US and China, and probably both of them trying to have their spheres of influence, economic and political. And then you have this chapter that you briefly summarized, but there's a lot of meat in that chapter about whether trade integration, whether convergence leads necessarily to conflict, and whether trade integration leads to conflict. We have the European example, right? At the European level, both of these things, convergence and trade integration, happen, and they so far have avoided conflict for many decades, and that's a success story. So what does it make, why at the global level we have to be so pessimistic that this necessarily leads to conflict? Or could we have some middle of the way scenario of a new Cold War between US and China, where both are so strong that they don't want to attack each other?
Like Adam Smith, balance of power. No, I'm not pessimistic. I just leave it open. But there are two things that I would like actually to mention in response to your question. The first one, obviously we don't know what will be the future of China. We don't know what will be the future of other countries and who will become democracy or not. I think even the definition, actually, I don't know if you noticed, but I almost don't use the word democracy in the book. I actually think this is one of the words that has become totally overused. Like jeans, when you wear them every day for 10 years, they just get overused. And this is like the word. For me, it's actually like people under communism. You use the word all the time, and eventually it means nothing. So actually, I don't use it, but we don't know what will happen. There could be sort of self-destruction of democracy, maybe like Trump, or maybe China will become democratic. We don't know. But I think that China, there was a part that you alluded to, China cannot be absorbed in a US-led system because it's too big. US-led system was a hierarchical system where the US was on the top, the Five Eyes were the second layer, then large European countries were the third layer, and then you go further down. But that system it could not absorb Russia. How can it absorb China? It's too big. And the China, whether it is democratic, anti-democratic, or whatever, is not going to accept the role that it believes doesn't belong, that is not equivalent to her power. So that was on what I was going to say, on difficulty or impossibility or absorption of China within a hierarchical system. But on Europe, I have to say one thing that not everybody agrees with that, but as you know, there is a theory, and I think reasonable theory, that European peace is a hegemonic peace. There was a hegemon. The hegemon never wants to have other people whom he's controlling starting fighting. His power is derived from maintenance of peace. So once the hegemon says, okay, I'm no longer hegemoning you, I want to go somewhere else, the maintenance of peace then becomes more problematic. So the interpretation of the European Union has this double interpretation. It is integration that brought countries together, and indeed, actually, for Eastern Europe, has brought convergence. But whether it is brought to peace or the peace was brought by the US, I think that's where the different, I understand from political scientists or international relations people, they differ.
I think we're out of time, so I'm going to thank first Professor Milanovic for sharing his thoughts with us. And those of you who sent questions, thank you very much for all the interesting questions, and apologies to those of you who sent a question and I couldn't read. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about these issues. It's been a pleasure to read the book. It's not yet available in Spain, but it will be at some point, and definitely you can buy it on Kindle if you do that sort of thing. Thank you to the Foundation for organizing this event. It's been fantastic to be here. Thanks to all of you.
Well, thank you very much to the Foundation. Thank you for really excellent ability to allow me to have a discussion with such excellent questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.